This is the United States Declaration of Independence, one of the most famous documents in history. An inspiration to oppressed peoples throughout the world, it is part of the familiar story of the American Revolution. Liberty triumphant, and the world turned upside down. Documents at the National Archives can help us tell the story of the American Revolution from a British point of view. Through them, we can also catch a glimpse of the ordinary people swept up in these extraordinary events, torn between rebellion and loyalty, and between very different ideas of freedom.
What they have to tell us is often surprising. Even the words of the Declaration itself have unexpected origins. It's perhaps best to start with what the world looked like before it was turned upside down, and it was a world very different from our own.
This is a map of North America in 1763. Britain had just won the 7 Years' War against France and her allies, making it the leading colonial power in the region. As you can see, the 13 British colonies are confined to the eastern seaboard. The map shows their territory stretching as far as the Mississippi River. But in fact, settlement was not supposed to extend beyond the Appalachian Mountains. That was because the colonists shared their world with indigenous nations, such as the Mohawk and other members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. These nations were politically autonomous, but the British considered them to be under royal protection. That's the reason for proclamations like this one, which seeks to avoid violence by forbidding colonists to settle on indigenous hunting grounds west of the Appalachians. As the colonies grew, so did their frustration at these limitations.
And they were not the only source of tension between the colonists and the Crown. After the 7 Years' War, Britain was also determined to reorganise its empire and fundamentally reshape the relationship with its American colonies. There would be more direct control from London. From this point on, all trade would go through Britain, as this customs book shows. There had always been some restrictions on free trade in the colonies, but this new arrangement was bitterly resented and smuggling was rife. There would also be higher taxation. The 7 Years' War had cost Britain dear, and the government in London was determined that the colonists should pay their share of the war debt. If that wasn't enough, continuing threats against the colonies from France and Spain had to be deterred. That meant a permanent military presence on the ground, and once again the colonies were expected to bear part of the cost.
This is the notorious Stamp Act of 1765. For the first time, it allowed Parliament to tax business conducted within the colonies themselves. By the terms of the Act, every contract, every will, every deed, every piece of official printed matter would be taxed. Everything, including newspapers, would have to bear stamps to show that tax had been paid on the paper they were printed on. For the colonists, it was a regular reminder of the British government's interference in daily life. As the American colonies returned no MPs to Parliament, and so had no say in the making of its laws, many thought this was taxation without representation, a tyrannical imposition. The Act was met with organised resistance by radical groups in the colonies, such as the Sons of Liberty. In this letter, Philadelphia stamp distributor John Hughes complained to the British Treasury about the violence and intimidation he'd suffered. At first, Britain didn't take the colonists' objections seriously. After all, most people in Britain didn't have the vote either, and they often paid far more tax. Surely the colonists could see how they would benefit from a stronger, more financially stable British government. They were British too, weren't they? In less than a year, the Stamp Act was repealed. If, however, the colonists thought that Britain was backing down, they were seriously mistaken. This is the American Colonies Act, known as the Declaratory Act. It insists upon the supremacy of the British Parliament over the 13 colonies in America. It stated emphatically that Parliament's laws trumped any decisions passed by local colonial assemblies, and that it had the right to tax the colonies.
Hot on its heels, and despite continued protests from British colonists, came these Townshend Acts, named after the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend. They strengthened the powers of Britain's customs officers, tightened measures against smuggling, and imposed tariffs on goods imported from Britain, such as paint, paper and tea. Boston, Massachusetts, a major port, was hit particularly hard. Many Bostonians were merchants or seafarers. Geographically and socially mobile, they were fiercely protective of the maritime trade on which their hometown was built.
What made things worse were the tax breaks the British government had offered the East India Company in the Tea Act of 1773. The company, an important part of the imperial economy, was struggling and needed support. The effect, however, was to make the tea it imported much cheaper than the tea sold by colonial traders. For the Sons of Liberty in Boston, this was the last straw. On December 16, 1773, they boarded 3 East India Company ships and threw their cargoes of tea overboard. They were disguised as Mohawk warriors. This was in part to avoid any repercussions for their actions, but also they were sending a message. This was a protest by colonists directly asserting a distinctly American identity. This is British officer Alexander Leslie's first-hand account of the so-called Boston Tea Party. He says that the Sons of Liberty have destroyed 340 chests of tea. The Sons of Liberty denied the allegation. They said it was 342. Leslie's account of the Tea Party was only one of many that made its way back to Britain. You can find plenty in our archive, expressing any number of contending viewpoints. Here, for instance, in the Massachusetts and Boston Weekly newspaper, there's a far more positive version of events. The protesters are described as brave and resolute, taking care that no injury was sustained to persons or property. Apart from the tea, of course. That was worth more than £1 million in today's money. But the facts were secondary. In the race to control the narrative, newspapers, like this, could spread their version of events through the colonies much faster than official British sources.
Usually, it was public opinion at home that mattered far more to the government in London. Keen to make an example of Boston and the Massachusetts colony, Parliament imposed a crackdown. This is the form it took. These are the so-called Intolerable Acts, passed in 1774. Their harshness and the zeal with which British officials were expected to impose them put pressure on those officials and pushed many colonists into open armed resistance. From this point, British troops could be housed pretty much wherever their commanders saw fit. Trade was frozen, and Boston had to repay the East India Company for its losses. Colonists who were used to electing their own councillors would now have those councillors chosen by the British. Most sinister of all, perhaps, local courts could no longer prosecute government officials for murder and other capital crimes. Massachusetts protested these acts, but it was only one of 13 colonies which all had different interests. As this statistical table from 1769 showing American imports and exports demonstrates. The economies of the northern colonies tended to be based on trade. The South, by contrast, had grown considerably wealthier on the profits from agricultural commodities such as tobacco. This productivity often relied on the exploited labour of enslaved people. By this time, the population of the 13 colonies was about 2.5 million. Of them, 460,000 people, that's about 18% of the total, were enslaved.
In late 1774, the British intercepted this letter from Benjamin Franklin, a British-American intellectual and politician from Massachusetts. Franklin was in London to act as an envoy for his home state. He had, for instance, spoken in Parliament against the Stamp Act. At this point, he was still looking for a solution to the developing crisis and not trying to stoke a breakaway movement. Nevertheless, he observes here that the British strategy relied on Massachusetts being neglected by every other colony. The way ahead was clear. Only by acting as one could the 13 colonies have any hope of resisting the power of the British Empire. A network of committees of correspondence facilitated communication between the colonies. In September 1774, representatives of all 13 colonies met at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They had different grievances and different priorities, but they were united in their opposition to what they called Britain's ruinous system of colony administration. They struck back with this Act of Association, using economic sanctions, including a non-importation agreement on luxury goods from Britain, and threatening a complete ban on exports from America. As the colonies worked together, a new and distinct identity was beginning to take shape among them. It was strengthened when, in February 1775, Britain declared Massachusetts to be an open rebellion. Full military force could now be used against the colonists there, but it was an escalation that carried enormous risks. The intolerable acts were widely seen as excessive, and many supported their repeal. Congress, meanwhile, was busy stockpiling weapons and organising the colony's scattered local militias into a structured fighting force. All it needed was a spark.
On April 19, 1775, British troops were on a mission to confiscate a store of rebel military supplies at two small towns outside Boston, Lexington and Concord. They were met by a well-organised rebel militia. This anonymous, pro-British account suggests that the rebels shot first. This unfortunate affair has happened through the rashness and impudence of a few people who began firing on the troops at Lexington. But rebel accounts carried by sympathetic newspapers, such as this one, the Georgia Gazette, promote a different narrative. For them, the so-called shot heard around the world was proof of British aggression. The troops of His Britannic Majesty commenced hostilities upon the people of this province, it says, attended with circumstances of cruelty not less brutal than our venerable ancestors received from the vilest savages of the wilderness.
Nevertheless, the Second Continental Congress had still not abandoned all hope of reconciliation. This is the so-called Olive Branch Petition they sent to London in July 1775. It bears the signatures of many who would later be mythologized as the founding fathers of the emerging nation. It states that if the intolerable acts were repealed, the colonies would once again be at peace with Britain. But it was too late, because heading in the opposite direction across the Atlantic was this royal proclamation. It declared that all the colonies were now in open rebellion and justified a military response to bring the traitors to justice. The British Empire and the 13 colonies were at war. At the start of hostilities, the British were badly outnumbered by rapidly mobilising rebel forces. Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, saw an opportunity to raise troops whilst disrupting the rebel economy. Dunmore was an enslaver and profited from the colony's plantation system. Nevertheless, in this, the Dunmore Proclamation of November 1775, he offered freedom to people enslaved by Virginians if they would come and fight for the British. Thousands answered the call to become Black Loyalists. Allied Indigenous nations, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, were initially inclined to see the rebellion as an internal British dispute. In this account of the Haudenosaunee Congress at Niagara in May 1776, the Confederacy resolved to maintain peace with both the King and the Bostonians. But under the pressures of war, this agreement fractured, with some factions within the Confederacy's 6 nations fighting for the British and others for the rebels.
And so we arrive at this, the founding document of the United States of America. It was famously influenced by Enlightenment ideas of individual rights over traditional social orders. English-born Thomas Paine's book, Common Sense, which advocated independent Republican government, helped to spread these ideas throughout the 13 colonies. But other influences might be more surprising. Representatives of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had been invited to Philadelphia while the Declaration was being drafted, and members of Congress, like Benjamin Franklin, took inspiration from indigenous nations when developing their political ideas. The ringing phrase, "We the people," for instance, echoes the Haudenosaunee belief in the importance of the collective and the equality of voices within it. There would be no turning back now. The Declaration was a rallying cry for Americans, but it was also an invitation to potential allies to join the conflict.
Britain had 2 armies in North America. One, under General Burgoyne, was expecting to meet the other under General Howe. Otherwise, they risked being outnumbered by the rebel Continental Army. When Howe instead headed off to attack Philadelphia, Burgoyne was resoundingly beaten at the battles of Saratoga. This was a catastrophic defeat for the British so early in the war. Under these Articles of Convention, signed after Burgoyne's defeat, more than 6,000 British troops surrendered. They remained captive for the rest of the conflict. The French jumped at the opportunity this presented, issuing this declaration of friendship with the new United States.
With the future uncertain and the outcome too close to call, ordinary colonists were forced to choose a side. Here is a list of over 3,000 New Yorkers who swore an oath of allegiance to the king. And here, less than 18 months before the end of the war, are 2,000 people who swore a similar oath of allegiance to the crown down in South Carolina.
The support of local people was vital to the British war effort. They needed their local knowledge for navigation, foraging, and tactical advantage. In this petition, Anne Neville of New Jersey speaks of her service as a pilot, guiding escapees from Burgoyne's defeated army back to British lines. Choosing allegiance to the Crown or to the rebellion was not an easy decision. Neville was imprisoned for activities by her rebel neighbours. The revolution felt like a civil war. Families were split apart, and there was much soul-searching amongst those with divided loyalties. The rebel-elected Maryland governor, Thomas Johnson, here says that, although my blood is every drop of it English, British misgovernment now binds me to support my country in independence. It's important to remember that Britain was a world power. North America, though key, was not its only concern. Its Caribbean colonies exploited the labour of enslaved people to produce sugar, a more lucrative commodity even than Virginian tobacco. These colonies also needed protection from the French and Spanish. Here we can see the result of those competing responsibilities. Both the British Army and Navy were perilously overstretched in the Atlantic, leaving North America's eastern coastline accessible to the rebels and their French allies.
British Commander-in-Chief Henry Clinton's solution to the shortage of troops was to extend the terms of the Dunmore Proclamation across all 13 colonies. He'd noted that rebels were increasingly deploying enslaved and less frequently free black personnel. This, the Philipsburg Proclamation, offers freedom to anyone enslaved by rebels if they joined the British cause. And this muster lists the Black Pioneers, a Black Loyalist scout regiment. Among their number is Sergeant Thomas Peters, who had escaped enslavement in North Carolina. He became a staunch advocate for Black Loyalist rights, first in North America and later in Sierra Leone, where he was a founding member of the Freetown settlement. When so many names have been lost to history, this is a precious record of individuals who risked everything in the cause of freedom.
Britain's Indigenous allies, like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, could expect no mercy from Washington's Continental Army. This document discusses the Sullivan Expedition, a military venture led by the rebel general John Sullivan. George Washington proposed the expedition as a punitive response to raiding along the frontier by a splinter faction of the Mohawk who were working with the British. The rebels claimed that they were exacting revenge for the terror that such raids had spread amongst colonists in America's interior. This account, by a member of the Onondaga Nation, describes the Continental Army's attacks on the Haudenosaunee people, and that they put to death all the women and children, excepting some of the young women, whom they carried away for the use of their soldiers. The offensive aimed to disrupt the society of Indigenous people and eliminate any threat that they might pose to the future United States. After years of conflict, George Washington accepted the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781. The fighting there was over, but the peace would leave many feeling abandoned by both sides. For instance, the ceasefire negotiated at Yorktown did not include Indigenous nations, now forced to fight on without British support.
Loyalist refugees, who had lost everything, poured into New York, where the British Army was waiting to leave the former American colonies. The city's population ballooned to double its pre-war size. Here, they are in their hundreds, grouped by colony of origin, facing an uncertain future after the imminent British withdrawal. Sustaining a colonial war was a major logistical challenge, a challenge that continued during the ceasefire. This massive document traces the supply lines that made it possible to equip British forces during their final year in New York. Meanwhile, peace negotiations were in full swing.
The American negotiators were accountable to the merchants and plantation owners who still formed the United States political elite. The negotiators fixated on the restoration of all confiscated property, which they insisted included formerly enslaved people. This draft treaty has a very telling annotation, preventing the British from carrying away any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants. Accordingly, many Americans arrived in New York, intending to re-enslave Black Loyalists, and many were re-enslaved, but not all. British Commander-in-Chief Guy Carleton believed in honouring the promise his government had made in the Dunmore and Philipsburg proclamations. If someone could prove that they had self-emancipated from a rebel enslaver before the ceasefire at the end of 1782, they would remain free. Here, Judith Jackson, who had escaped enslavement under the Dunmore Proclamation, petitioned Carleton for British protection. She describes how she was threatened with re-enslavement by a man who, she says, took my money from me and stole my child. About 9,000 formerly enslaved people escaped the 13 colonies and moved to other British territories, predominantly Nova Scotia. 3,000 of them are recorded here, in the Book of Negroes. You can find Judith Jackson numbered amongst them, but there is no mention of her daughter. After this, Judith herself, like so many others, disappears from the pages of history. In total, around 60 to 80,000 Loyalists fled the United States after the war, taking 15,000 still enslaved people with them. As well as Nova Scotia, they resettled in other parts of Canada, the Caribbean, and Britain itself.
The peace treaty was signed in Paris in September 1783. In it, Britain officially recognised the United States and gave up its claim to the 13 colonies. After all the blood that had been shed in the cause of freedom, the treaty made no mention of or provision for the Indigenous nations. And despite its limited offer of freedom for the Black Loyalists, Britain would not abolish slavery in its empire for another half-century.
This is a map of North America in 1785, the first map of the continent published in the new United States. Britain retained a profitable colony in Canada, but ceded Florida back to Spain. The 13 colonies were now an uneasy, independent confederation of United States. You can see the personification of liberty, reclining, triumphant, next to the new Stars and Stripes flag. Free from British precaution, the United States prepared to expand westwards across the continent, and to take its place on the world stage.